Ooh, in an understanding of how grass grows. And so Damon and I are going to talk a little bit about some of those concepts about pasture plant growth, so that with subsequent sessions you can maybe understand, have an appreciation for um, how pastures are managed and why grazers do the things that they do. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit, going over some very basic plant physiology with regards to plant growth. With all plants, growth comes from areas of actively growing cells that are called, aptly enough, growing points. Um, in grasses, these are located at they start out anyways, at the base of the stem. And you can see on this diagram, this area here is your growth point. So these would be the leaves that are coming out of each tiller. A tiller is a shoot. A grass plant consists of a collection of tillers, and each one of these um, has their own growth point. When the grass is in its vegetative state, meaning that it's putting out a lot of leafy growth, that growth point stays close to the ground. Okay. Um, when the grass starts making a transition to its reproductive phase, that stem starts to elongate. So these are the different nodes on the stem. And eventually, some point in the growing season, these nodes are going to elongate, the stem is going to elongate, and that growing point is going to start developing into the inflorescent, which is then going to produce your seeds. Um, and that growing point stays at the top. Um, with legumes, the growing point is always going to be at the top of the stem. Okay. Um, the location of that growing point is important because as long as that growing point is intact, then the plant can put out continually new growth at a good pace. When that growing point is removed, then that kind of stalls plant growth temporarily, because with that growing point removed, then new growth has to originate at buds that are dormant at the base of the plant. You know, you would have these crown buds on legumes like clovers or alfalfa. You've got dormant buds at the crown of the grass plant as well. So that takes a little bit more time to do that. So the object um, with grazing is to go with plants where you can keep the growing point intact relatively easily. So these are some decent illustrations, but I just want to show things in real life. So this is a grass. This is not from a pasture. This is actually winter rye, but cereal grains are grasses in it, and it shows the same patterns. So this is a single crown, and you can see all of these individual tillers um, coming out from that crown. If you were to take one of those tillers and then split it open, this is what you would see. And right there at that red arrow, that's your growing point. So for the next few weeks, several weeks, that growing point is going to stay down at the base of the plant, maybe raised to an inch or so, and it's just going to churn out new leafy growth. Later on, around here, probably at the end of May, that growing point is going to start elevating, and it's going to be more vulnerable to grazing, to removal by grazing. This is a white clover from a pasture. Now, I mentioned that the growing point on legumes stays at the top of the plant, at the tip of the stem. And that can make grazing species like red clover or alfalfa that have um, fairly tall, upright growth habits more difficult because that growing point is always going to be vulnerable to being removed by grazing. White clover is a little bit different. That growing point is still at the tip of the stem, but those stems tend to be low to the ground because white clover has that sort of creeping prostrate growth habit. So those growing points are not at the tips of the leaves right here. These are individual leaves. The growing points are going to be here. There's going to be another growing point here, probably another developing plant over here. So because they stay so low to the ground, they're going to be out of the way of normal grazing activity. You can see the effect of removing growing points here. So this is not on a pasture, this is a hay field. And this photo would have been taken sometime in mid-July, about a week or so after a second cutting. So this is a mixed stand featuring both Timothy and orchard grass. Now, both of those grasses, each of those grasses grows a little bit differently. Timothy tends to grow where its growing points are a little bit elevated at all times. All of those tillers are going to make that transition to that reproductive phase, which keeps those growing points a few inches above the soil surface. Orchard grass will have those reproductive tillers, but they also have a number of vegetative tillers that never make that transition to the reproductive stage. So with each crown of orchard grass, there's going to be a series of tillers that are just always going to stay vegetative, and they're going to be able to put out new growth really quickly. So in this field, you can see that the Timothy in the surrounding area is growing back fairly slowly, but you've got this crown of orchard grass that's a few inches above everything that's around it, because those growing points are still low to the ground and the plant is able to put out good growth. And that's going to be the case with, as I mentioned, species vary with their ability to tolerate grazing, and a lot of that has to do with the location of the growing points in there. Your alfalfa, your red clover, your growing point is going to be over here. Your ladino clover or your white clover, it's going to be here close to the surface. And the same thing with grasses. So bluegrass and orchard grass, the growing point stays fairly low, out of the way of grazing livestock. Other grasses don't quite behave in the same way. That's not the slide that I was expecting in there. Okay, moving on. When it comes to management practices, the idea is to protect the growing point in there, okay? So we're going to monitor our grazing height, and we're going to make sure that animals aren't grazing so low that they're removing that growing point. We want to keep the plants growing so that they stay vegetative and putting out plenty of high quality forage throughout the season. Okay, so for moving from growing points now to carbohydrates. So all plants photosynthesize, and that means that they're going to be accumulating carbohydrates as they're absorbing sunlight. And these carbohydrates are stored in the root system generally, and they're a source of energy for the plants with its various growth processes that are taking place. Um, Photosynthesis decreases with leaf area. And there's a relationship between the amount of carbohydrates that are in reserve and the growth that takes place after harvest. On this graph, this line here is going to be plant dry matter accumulation. So here you go from 100% yield, you remove 80% of the material with harvest, and then over time that dry matter starts to accumulate. This line here are those carbohydrates or those energy reserves. And again, you start out at 100%. And then after harvest, there's a big drawdown on those carbohydrate reserves because the plant doesn't have enough leaf area to generate enough energy to fuel that growth. So it draws on those energy reserves, and there's a big drawdown almost all the way down until you get to a certain point. When growth starts accumulating and then you've got some more leaf area, photosynthesis can start taking over, and then it can start replacing those energy reserves that were drawn down and eventually make it back up to 100%. So the idea would be, it's nothing wrong with drawing down on those energy reserves, but we don't want to overdo it. With overgrazing, you can have continually drawing down on those energy reserves without giving the plant enough time to replenish them. And after too much of that management, the plant is going to be weakened. As far as how you can tell, where an actual plant is on this line. Some people have kind of developed a method looking at the number of fully emerged leaves on grass plants in there. Okay, and you can see that different stages of grass correspond to different carbohydrate levels. So right after grazing, when you start to get some new growth, you've got one leaf starting to emerge, okay? And then with that regrowth is fueled by those carbohydrate reserves, and there's that drawdown that we were talking about. When you start getting when that first leaf is fully emerged, and then you start getting a second leaf starting to emerge, you're starting to get enough leaf area to get some photosynthetic activity to start replacing those carbohydrates, but it's still pretty low. Once you've got that second leaf is fully emerged, and then you start getting a third, you're almost back to where you need to be. And then finally, once those three leaves are fully emerged, that's your sign that your carbohydrate reserves are fully replenished. If you've got a fourth leaf coming out, then probably that first leaf that emerged is actually going to start dying off. So keeping your grasses at that stage where there's three fully formed leaves, that's your signal that the pasture is ready to go. And waiting much longer than that is actually going to be maybe wasting a little bit of forage, because you're going to have some of those older leaves starting to die off. Here's something that shows that. These are some photos from University of Kentucky, where they had one pond where they simulated continuous grazing. So kept cutting it down and really cut it down to just about an inch. On the other side, they left a taller stubble, and it was simulated rotational grazing, where grasses were allowed to rest and allowed to accumulate carbohydrates. And so if you're starting out like this on day one, and then you see over time, over the course of just 6 days, you can see the difference in growth. On the continuous grazing, where it was grazed down low, where you don't leave a lot of leaf area and it's not allowed to recover properly, sure, you get some regrowth, but it's pretty small compared to the rotational grazing, where you've got much more growth in the same span of time due to leaving more leaf area. So you can start that photosynthetic activity sooner, and you've got a good reserve of carbohydrates in that root system to fuel that early regrowth. And just to see them all together like that, you can see that it's pretty dramatic. Again, this just being over the course of 6 days. I see, are there any questions on anything that we've covered so far?
Actually, Carl, Bill Fosher asked a question about the four-leaf rule, if you want to look in the question and answer box.
Okay. So Bill is asking if this four-leaf rule is true for diploid varieties or just tetraploid varieties. That diagram showed perennial ryegrass, and perennial ryegrass comes in both diploid varieties or tetraploid. Tetraploid varieties tending to have wider leaves in there. To be honest, I don't know. I think of it less as something that's specific to ryegrass in general, and more as sort of a general thing for grasses, that having those three fully formed leaves being a indicator that you've got enough growth to replenish those carbohydrate reserves. So I don't know about what differences there might be within perennial ryegrass varieties. Okay. Let's see. All right. I had mentioned before that not all species tolerate grazing equally. Some species, like Timothy, as I mentioned earlier, have those growing points that tend to be elevated so that they're more vulnerable to being removed with grazing, and they might be better suited for mechanical harvest. Certain legumes have that upright growth habit versus a more creeping growth habit. And this was this diagram is basically a way to just sort of group that and sort of organize it as far as which species tend to be better suited for grazing, which species tend to be better suited for one reason or another to mechanical harvest, and which species might work well for both. All of these species tend to grow back more slowly down here, where they're best suited for mechanical harvesting. Among those species that tolerate grazing really well, something like Kentucky bluegrass and ladino clover, it's not that you can't harvest them mechanically, but they tend to be small species, tend to be fairly short growing. And while they perform really well in pastures, a stand of pure Kentucky bluegrass may not be all that high yielding for mechanical harvest, and may not may not be worth your while. Species like orchard grass or meadow fescue tolerate grazing well, but they also yield a little bit more. So they might be better suited to a mixed system that where you're including both grazing and mechanical harvest in there. Um, I also put on this that I showed where species are best adapted. Okay. Um, and that's an important consideration for putting the right grass in the right place. Some species are better suited to droughty areas, so something like birdsfoot trefoil or orchard grass tend to do well if they're in a drier or they can tolerate a certain amount of droughtiness, um, and might be best suited in more well-drained soils. Other species like to have a little bit more moisture in them. So species, especially like perennial ryegrass, Kentucky bluegrass, tend to do best when in more moderately well-drained conditions where there's enough moisture. Kentucky bluegrass, if it's put on a um, um, on a droughty site, tends to go dormant pretty quickly as soon as hot, dry weather hits. So these would be things to keep in mind when you're trying to determine which grass, which species would be best suited for a given site.
Hey, Carl, before you move on from that slide, I just had one thing I thought I'd chime in about, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So, you're talking grazing versus mechanical harvest. What that really comes down to is the amount of recovery time that those grasses have between harvest events, whether it's grazing or through mechanical harvesting. So, depending on your management, some of those that are down in the mechanical harvesting realm might still work okay if you leave lots of residual and long recovery times potentially. But I think this is a great point that it's some do better with more frequent defoliation and some don't do so well. And so that's kind of how these are categorized, and I think it's a nice, really good graphical representation of it.
And that's a good point, that it's not that you can't graze Timothy or smooth brome or red clover. There are plenty of people out there that do. However, with that extra care that you need to give it, in some cases, here, we've got it can be enough of a challenge to come up with the right number of paddocks and the right number of rotation when you've got species that do well with more frequent defoliation, so that you're not running out of forage midway through the summer. And when you've got these species that require an even longer recovery time before you can graze them again, that can make it more challenging. But by all means, they're great grasses, and they can be grazed, and it can be done.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Just wanted to chime in on that just a little bit. So
No, good
thanks.
point. Good point. All right. I think I've got one more. All right. So one more slide here is just to have a reminder that along with your plant growth, that you want to pay attention to forage quality as well. So as plants accumulate dry matter, when they're in that vegetative stage, there's a lot of leaves. Those leaves are highly digestible. They're really rich in protein. They may not necessarily have a lot of carbohydrates in them because those carbohydrates are all kind of getting diverted down into that root system as things are replenishing. As plants accumulate dry matter, they get to a point where protein levels, your carbohydrate levels start increasing, but then you get to a point where fiber starts increasing as well. And while a lot of ruminant animals can certainly make good use of fiber, it can limit their production. because fiber isn't as digestible. It takes longer to digest in their rumen. And while that rumen is staying full with fibrous feed, that means it's not taking, those animals aren't taking in feed that's more easily digested and maybe a little bit higher in concentration. So among everything else, you want to make sure that your grass is in a stage of growth where it's still got some nutritive value to it. And if you're over here, once that head has emerged, and way beyond here where that head is fully emerged and maybe starting to senesce a little bit, your forage quality is really starting to to go downhill there. So just wanted to make that point. And I think that's all I've got. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Damon.
Yeah, well, thank you, Carl. That's great. And that, for those of you that attended last week's session, Rick and Elena touched on kind of that nutrient quality that you were mentioning, and it's nice to see that graph to kind of relate it back to the previous week's session. I don't see anything in the chat or in the question and answer, so I'm gonna just go ahead, but feel free, anyone, to, as I'm going along, throw in questions in the chat or in the question and answer box. And if it's really kind of pertinent to exactly what I'm talking about, then I will, Carl or Michelle will chime in and stop me, or we'll just wait until after. So, thank you, Carl, for that great overview of what happens above ground. And I wanted to focus a little bit on what happens below ground because it's often overlooked. And so when we manage with the roots in mind as well, we really start amplifying the resilience and soil health for our pastures, and that has some really good benefits that I'll get into. Soil health is really the favorite term right now. NRCS, we have a big push about soil health, but really whatever you call it, getting that soil and plant ecosystem to be robust will really make your system more resilient to changes, and often quite a bit more productive as well. So Carl, if you don't mind moving to the next slide. So, as grass grows, the roots grow deeper. So, roughly you have about the same volume of roots below ground as you do forage above ground. So there's about an even amount so that it can, the above ground forage can be supported by those roots. Go ahead and to the next slide there, Carl. So this is a really nice slide that kind of shows what management impact can have, what your impact your management can have on the root systems. And so you've got tall fescue, which some folks in New England, it's a dirty word, but this is a good example. I think this is from a little further south of here. But so you've got the tall fescue with rotational grazing, and right next to it you've got the continuous grazing. And you can really see the significant difference in the root structures of those two grasses. So if you've got that continuous grazing and you're not allowing those plants to grow taller, those root systems are going to be significantly diminished. And you can also see with orchard grass, there's a couple of, over further to the right, there's a couple of orchard grass examples, and then a fescue bluegrass rotational on the end. And I also like this slide too. So for New England, this is a fairly, fairly good representation of the rooting depth that will we'll see here in the Northeast in most soils. And that's in part to do with the depth of our topsoil. Some of the slides I have coming up are from a variety of places around the country. And so the rooting depths are quite a bit deeper, but they show a nice kind of show nice examples. So that's why I included them. But I just wanted to, I think the next slide has a 7-foot rooting depth. And I don't think there are many soils in New England where we would where we would reach that rooting depth. So this is a nice picture of what rooting depth we could expect in most soils in New England. And so Carl, if you don't mind moving to the next slide. Thank you. So yeah, so here's that 7-foot rooting depth that we're not often going to see, but it does show, a nice graphic of when left alone to grow, the grass plants replace about 30% of their roots each year. And this really contributes to the organic matter of the soil, and it provides those roots sloughing off, provide a lot of good food for microorganisms in the soil. So that said, under grazing systems, the root system size is much more dynamic, because when you allow the grasses to grow up, then you graze them back down, it sloughs off more roots to keep that matching size, matching volume of above ground and below ground. And so it tries to maintain roughly that balance. So as you go through a rotational grazing system, that can really amplify some of the benefits that you have with provided by these roots that are sloughed off in the soil. Next slide, Carl. So one really interesting thing, this is from a study that was done quite a while ago, actually, but there's, you may have heard the old adage, when you're grazing, you want to take half, leave half of the forage volume that you see. And this, it quite drastically demonstrates that point, where up to 50%, there really isn't much impact on root growth. But once you get up to about 60% of the leaf volume removed, you all of a sudden get half of the roots stop growing temporarily. And then once you get up to 80%, you have that 100% roots stoppage of root growth. And it also takes 12 days for those roots to start regrowing after you've taken 80%. And if you take 90% of the leaf volume, then it can take up to 18 days for those roots to start regrowing. So you can see what effect that forage volume removal can have on the type of root system that you're going to have, as we saw in the earlier slide. So next slide, Carl, please. So here's a nice demonstration from, again, this is fescue from down south, and we won't have necessarily 3-foot rooting depths all that often here, but this shows a really nice comparison of frequent defoliation. So the one on the right, it was harvested every 2 days, the one in the middle every 7 days, and then the one on the left is every 21 days. And it's a very significant difference in the rooting depth and the root volume that you have there. And so, as we're thinking of resilience, and in the Northeast here, we're often thinking of the drought that we're dealing with right now. What root system do you want to have in a drought? I would definitely go towards the one on the left. I imagine everyone else would as well. because that rooting depth is going to have to help reach down lower into the soil to scavenge water deeper down. But I would also want you to think about, what rooting system would you want if it's really wet? If you've got a really nice established root system and you get a lot of rain for a week or two, and your pastures are really sensitive at that point to uh, pugging up or compaction or whatever. Whether it's just compaction, you don't really see much disturbance, or maybe there's some disturbance in the soil if it's really wet from the hooves of the animals. You know, if you have a more robust root system, that's going to protect a little bit more from compaction, and it's also going to hold the sod in place a bit better. So something to think about, that roots are often thought you know to only deal with water, pulling up water, but having that nice fibrous mat can work pretty well to help protect against compaction and disturbance in the soil. Next slide, Carl. So, those root systems can also really benefit in a drought, not only just reaching down deeper, um, but it can also help with infiltration. Those root systems can help provide a good situation for water to infiltrate into the soil much quicker. So what we have here is a rainfall simulator that is, many of you may have seen if you've seen any NRCS presentations. We've got these all over the country. And what happens is people take a chunk out of the soil of different pastures and then puts them into this into a frame, and then they put on simulated rainfall with a sort of a sprinkler, um, and then they capture where that runoff comes from. So on the very far right, you've got a overgrazed species A, which is the same as the one on the very far left, species A. Um, so you can see all the runoff, the surface runoff comes out in that front bucket, and then down in behind you can also see the bucket that has just a little bit in it, and that's the water that infiltrated through that sample of soil. So you go to the other end on the very left hand side. There's barely any water that had made it into that front bucket, but that back bucket you can see almost almost all the water has made it into there. So that shows the amount of infiltration that can happen and capturing the water that you do get. So if we are in a drought, like it's looking like parts of New England are going to head towards this year, if you're not in one already, getting the most effective capture of that rainfall can be really important. And so managing that taller grass can help slow the runoff as well. But then the roots, having a good root system can contribute to better infiltration. And there are a couple of ways that it does that. And the first is when those roots are growing, and then if they slough off and end up dying through grazing, or just that kind of 30% a year that is sloughed off, then those roots rot away or are consumed by the soil organisms, and they leave a little bit of a channel in the soil for the water to find its way down through. So that's one way. And then another way is if you have the soil ecosystem going really well, there's better formation of soil aggregates, and those soil aggregates kind of stick together. We talk often about you wanting your soil to look like cottage cheese, or kind of chunky and lumpy like that. And so when the pieces of soil are those aggregates are in there, they provide more pore space in between those larger chunks, so the water can find its way down through as well. So those are two of the primary ways that a more resilient and robust root system can contribute to better water infiltration. So not only is that root system going to have more surface area to pull up water, it can also help pull down water when you do get it in the form of rain. So next slide, please, Carl. So this deviates a little bit from the roots, but this is a really, really nice comparison that someone with NRCS did out in New York. What she did is on a really hot day, ambient temperature was 93 degrees. She went and looked at the soil temperature at 1 inch depth in a variety of different soil covers. So, the tall pasture is 83 degrees. Then you've got some mulched veggie beds at 90. Overgrazed pasture at, less than 1 inch of forage was 108. Bare soil is 115. And then the extreme under black plastic mulch is 128 degrees. So, I like to just look at the tall pasture versus overgrazed, and that's quite a significant difference in the temperature of the surface of the soil, and that can really increase evaporation, but it also can really slow down the or injure the soil microbes that are trying to work in that top layer of the soil. It'll really slow down the benefit that you get from those more functioning soil ecosystems. So having that taller residue or taller vegetation, whether it's residue or you're allowing it to grow, you end up with a much better soil temperature, which allows better functioning of the soil and less evaporation. Next slide, Carl, please. And just advance it one more too, please. Thank you. So if we're looking at overgrazing, there's some biological disturbance from it. You get the reduced root mass, you get increased weeds, reduced soil fungi, and we went over the water infiltration, soil temperature, and really diminishes the soil habitat from both the temperature, but also the roots I'll go into in a second have a big impact on feeding the soil food web. But you can you can see when you weaken the grasses and the forages that we want in a pasture, it allows other plants to come in that may be less desirable. So that's something that we really want to keep in mind. Next slide. So that said, depending on our management, some plants that we deem undesirable may actually be decent forage. Thistles, while many times animals will avoid them, have actually a pretty good nutrient content at certain life stages of growth. And many other plants that we deem as weeds can really be good nutrition for the animals if they will eat it. And so that comes down to how you manage your animals, and so grouping them up. And we'll talk about this a little next week, but grouping them up and creating a bit of a competition factor can make it so that they have less selectivity as they're going through your pastures, and so they'll consume things that you might think they might not. But really what I want to talk about is the roots. So if you are able to take advantage of kind of a more diverse sward of different plants, whether it's grasses, legumes, or other forbs, you know, you end up with a much more diverse root system, and that can add to your resilience as well. So these are plants from, this is a really nice representation of it. These are plants from, you know, a tall grass prairie, but you know, you can see it's a really nice example of the really cool differences in root structures and systems that they have. Um, so, you know, for example, you know, last year and back in 2016, when we had a pretty significant drought, I talked with a lot of people about, they were talking to me about the fields having a lot of Queen Anne's lace in it. And the grasses weren't doing well, but the Queen Anne's lace was going gangbusters. Well, that's because the grasses weren't able to compete with the Queen Anne's lace, and the Queen Anne's lace has a taproot that can reach deeper into the soil horizons and access that deeper water. So you know, that's just you know, an example here of kind of the varying root systems showing up in kind of the above ground um, attributes of fields. Um, also, you know, having that, if you can take advantage of the plants with varied root systems, they can add to your resilience, because in you know, in drought situations, some plants will do better, and in wetter situations, other plants will do better. But you can kind of ride out the variations in weather uh, better if you have more diversity. So um, yeah, that's it's great to have. Go ahead, Carl, to the next slide, please.
Damon, Damon,
Yeah.
quick, I'm sorry. Bill asked a question about plant growth stopping at a certain temperature. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, so that varies depending on the type of plant. You know, we have warm season grasses, cool season grasses. Primarily up here, it's cool season grasses, and I believe Bill, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I believe it's somewhere in the low 90s is for cool season grasses. Actually, I think it might even be lower than that. Carl, if you happen to know and can jump in, feel free. But I know cool season grasses really like it, you know, 50 to 70, I think. And then anywhere above 70, it really kind of diminishes. Not that they'll stop growing, but it really diminishes how happy they are, and they'll slow their growth.
Yeah, that would be my impression as well. I don't know, you know, I'm sure there is kind of a stopping point, kind of threshold there. I
Yep.
don't know exactly what that number is, but you know, here in the Northeast, anyways, where most of our pastures are based on cool season perennials, you want it to be cool.
Yeah, yeah. So the range of like 50 degrees to 70 degrees, or maybe mid 70s, is what I remember for the cool season grasses being happiest. So above that, they start declining in their growth vigor. So that's a great question. Thank you. And I also see Deb mentioned thistles and Queen Anne's lace are great plants for pollinators. So yeah, you know, adding to the diversity, you know, I think that's you know, I joke around with folks in New Hampshire and RCS that, you know, good grazing fixes all problems. You know, so you know, if you have a nice diverse pasture, you can also have a diversity of plants in there that, you know, will, you know, if they're able to bloom, you can have some benefits to pollinators. You can have all sorts of benefits to wildlife as well. So we'll thank you, Deb, for chiming in on that. And yeah, so back to this picture of roots, because we're really wanting to focus on this. You know, these roots create those nice root channels, and you know, help with infiltration, and can actually relieve compaction, as I mentioned, not only protect against to some degree, but it can also help slowly alleviate compaction. And then they also the roots also really kind of enmesh the soil aggregates, so they add stability to those aggregates that have been created by a good soil ecosystem. So I'll talk about this in a moment, but the roots actually have exudates and chemical signals that stimulate soil microbe activity and really create a lot of symbiotic benefits when that soil ecosystem is working really well. Um, and to get back to the diversity point, having that plant diversity is not only good, Deb, for the wildlife above ground. Having that diversity is also good for the diversity below ground. The variety of soil microbes, microorganisms, or larger organisms as well. Having a diversity of plant roots can really help bring a more robust, diverse microbe community. Yeah. Um, so an interesting little tidbit is when the soil is not being treated all that well, more than 70% of the microbial community can be inactive in soils until the conditions improve. So in many cases that those microbes are kind of sitting there waiting for the opportunity to flourish, and so we just need to um, really work to try and manage for that as much as possible. And the nice thing is, as Carl said in the beginning, good management of pastures is beneficial. Is also often parallel to good management of your animals and animal nutrition. Um, but it also goes hand in hand with good management of your underground livestock. That diversity underground and the root systems as well. So that's why I love grazing so much. Is everything seems to go hand in hand, and it can be tricky to change how you do things, but because things go hand in hand so well, you just see multiplying benefits if you're really able to get that system humming. So um, yeah, so Carl, if you don't mind going on to the next slide, that would be great.
Hang on here. There we go.
There we go. Thank you very much. So this is just one example with mycorrhiza fungi and their relation to plant roots. Not all plants have a symbiosis with mycorrhiza, but there are a good majority of them do. Um, but what actually happens, and this is really cool, I first learned about this a few years ago, and I think we're all still there's so much to learn about the soil ecosystem. The plants actually send quite a bit of carbon from photosynthesis. So really some sugars, some carbohydrates, that sort of stuff. They exude it out of their roots into the soil to feed fungi. In this case, it also feeds other soil microorganisms. But in this case, it feeds the fungi. Then the fungi can kind of act as a bit of an extension of the root system, and so it can really increase the absorptive root surface area up to, even as it says here, up to 10 times. And so you're really increasing that ability of that plant to pull in nutrients and water as well. So fungi can also really help. So in some cases, the plants can, as I mentioned earlier, can send out signals, or just by encouraging the fungi, the the plants actually have the fungi reach out into other parts of the soil, and they can break down um, factions of the soil to make nutrients more available to those plants, and it actually kind of brings those nutrients back to the plant. Um, so so um, so you've got Carl, if you don't mind going back one slide, thank you. So, especially in this case, phosphorus and zinc, um, for mycorrhiza fungi. But there are other relationships that do similar actions as well. And then fungi can really suppress pests and other diseases. So if there's, if there's a fungal disease that is trying to get established on those roots, if there are beneficial fungi kind of taking up all the space there or fighting off those other fungi for, competing for space on the roots, then that disease, that fungi that is trying to create, some sort of disease in that plant root, it will have a much harder time getting established because it's having to have more competition. And again, talking about those soil aggregates, the fungal networks really help to build those soil aggregates, which are really important. All right, next slide, Carl. So, this has a number of things on it, and we don't need to necessarily read all the tiny print here, but just the point that having a really healthy ecosystem of the soil and healthy plants by treating them right above ground, as Carl had talked about, can really help those plants deal with stress, whether it's drought, insects, waterlogging, any sort of toxicity in the soil or nutrient limitations, excessive heat. It can, just having that system working well can really be protective against any stresses that you have in your system. So it's really again, I just love this stuff. It's just really cool how when you get the system all working together, and everything just is a much more robust, resilient system. So it's really fun to see all the benefits, and we're really still learning a lot of the information, especially about what goes on underground, but also those plant interactions are really something that we're just starting to learn more about. So it's just really cool. So go on to the next slide as well, please, Carl. So to kind of conclude everything that that I've said here, to increase the resilience, we really need to manage the soil in addition to the plants. But in pasture management, that the nice thing is that really can go hand in hand. And treating those forages right can go a long way towards that healthier, more resilient system. So it's just a really cool really cool system. I love it. I love talking about it, much to many of my friends and my wife's dismay. I talk their ear off about it, but and anyone that gets close to me, so watch out. But I think with that we will I can kind of end it there. I don't know if there are questions in the chat or the question and answer pod, but we can.
It doesn't, you know what? I think you guys covered everything so extensively and well that there are no questions.
well, we're just amazing presenters, huh?
You are. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I want to thank everyone for coming. Next week, just know that we're continuing our grazing concepts for better farm resilient with management. So as Damon explained to me, last week we had the animal side of it. This week we had the grass side of it. Next week we'll how the human side of it works and bringing the two together. So that'll be next Wednesday, April 14th at 9 a.m. And the last one is the following Wednesday at on the 21st. And that is going to be how NRCS can help you with your grazing, with your regenerative plans, anything you need. So again, thank you for coming. Please go to Granite, our website at grazenewhampshire.com, sign up for our newsletter. And this recording will be put on our YouTube video channel in the next few days. And thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks, guys. Bye.